Great, fantastic. Okay, hello, and welcome on this Wednesday afternoon or morning or evening, depending where you're tuning in from, to this Anthropocene history seminar. This is a seminar that explores from a historical angle the Anthropocene as a concept in lots of different ways. Different themes. This week's theme is cities, and this is the first session of the academic year, the 2025-26 academic year for this seminar. So we have a great session to start us off with in cities. I'm going to be chairing the discussion today, but we have two wonderful historians who work on cities and urbanization here to present some of their own research and to answer questions today. So I'm going to introduce both of the speakers in turn. They're going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A, and we will go from there. So our first speaker today is Dr. Adrián Lerner. Adrián is Assistant Professor of Latin American History at the University of Cambridge. He's a specialist geographically on the Andes, on Brazil, and on the Amazon rainforest. Thematically, he's interested in the environment, urbanization, public health, authoritarianism, and many other issues besides, using that regional focus as a way of exploring all of those issues. Adrián has published widely. He's really written some fantastic stuff, including co-authoring a book on the relations between Peru and Brazil with Marcos Cueto. And he's currently finishing a book titled Jungled Cities, the Urbanization of Amazonia, and that's with Duke University Press. So we look forward to that. Our second speaker is Dr. Pollyanna Rhee. Pollyanna is a historian of the modern landscapes of the US and of Europe. And she's based at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champagne. Pollyanna is broadly interested in environmentalism as a political movement and category, landscapes, sustainability, and urban spaces. She's the author of a fantastic book that I have with me here. She's not paying me to promote it, but I would recommend reading it. That is Natural Attachments, the Domestication of American Environmentalism, which is a really great sort of peopled, bottom-up, placed history of environmentalism in the mid to late 20th century, those really key decades for that political movement. So as I've said, our speakers are going to go in turn. We're going to start with Adrián, and then we're going to move on to Pollyanna. They're both going to speak for 20, 25 minutes. They have some slides to share, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from there. So Adrián, please take us away.
Thanks very much, Andrew and Sophie and the rest of the organizers. Let me share my screen to show you some slides. I trust you can see that, but not in presentation mode yet. Let me just, of course, this is doing that. Okay. And thanks, thanks for running the seminar also, and thank you everybody in the audience for being here with us. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm working on a book manuscript called Jungled Cities, the Urbanization of Amazonia, which is a project that begins with the following realization, which is that the Amazon rainforest became urbanized during the 20th century. Nowadays, more than 80% of the people who live in the Amazon, some 30 million people, live in cities. A comparative urban environmental history, my book studies the region's two largest cities, Iquitos in Peru and Manaus in Brazil, which you can see there. And as you can see, they're both broadly in the path of the Amazon River. Manaus is a little bit 8 kilometers from the Amazon in the Rio Negro, but nevertheless. The other large city, before anybody gets upset, in the Amazon is Belém do Pará, which is in the estuary of the Amazon, but it's a very different kind of city, much more connected to the Atlantic world. So these are the two largest cities that are in the middle of the rainforest. So I asked basically how why and how this process of massive urbanization unfolded, why it took different forms in different places, how social and environmental elements interacted, how did forms of knowledge and socio-technical processes shape these interactions, and ultimately, what does it all mean for global environmental history? And for that, of course, the question of the Anthropocene, which is in many ways what brings us together today, is very much um, part of it. So, studying Iquitos and Manaus from their colonial 18th century origins until the present, I argue that Amazonian urbanization took the form of a long transition from an era in which the environment of the rainforest dominated urban life to one in which cities dominate the rainforest. This is from what I call precarious urbanization to planetary urbanization. And throughout, the limits between city and rainforest remain porous and defined by constant multidirectional influences. I argue that two critical historical junctures set Amazonian urbanization into long-term developmental paths. The first was the integration of Amazonia into national processes of state formation and global markets in the late 19th century, with the advent of steam navigation in the 1850s and then the Amazon rubber boom in the 1890s. And the second was the developmental predicaments of the military regimes of the Latin American Cold War era and the general crisis of explosive informal urbanization in Latin America and, of course, the global South more broadly. And to study this long transition punctuated by these critical junctures, I begin with case studies about water and precarious urbanization within the cities. I then study what I call the environmental marginalization of the so-called water slums in both Manaus and Iquitos as a culmination of this process and the beginning of a new critical juncture. And in the end, I study each city in detail during the second half of the 20th century, both in their internal developments and in terms of their relationship with the rainforest environment. I'm not going to get into all of that, obviously, today, so I'll give you a few samples, but do take into account that this is a comparative project. So in each part, I talk about both cities. Today, I will talk about one roughly in parts 1 and 3, and part 2, I'm going to very quickly talk about both. But feel free to ask questions about both and the comparative aspect of this, of course. So the first critical juncture was inaugurated by the Amazon rubber boom in the late 19th century. It's often portrayed as a rainforest Belle Époque, a civilizational epic, perhaps best exemplified by the Teatro Amazonas, Manaus Opera House, immortalized in the opening sequences of Werner Herzog's classic Fitzcarraldo, which is how most people outside of Brazil and Latin America know about Manaus. The process of frontier urban modernization was especially abrupt in places like this because of the contrast between the intensity of this initial accumulation in the conditions of the Amazonian frontier and also in the context of deep anxieties about succumbing to the environment, right? There's a long history and mythology of Amazonian cities reclaimed by the jungle. The rubber boom, moreover, was as short-lived as it was explosive. It ended once the wild rubber-based economy of the Amazon lost the global markets to emerging plantations in British Asia in the 1910s. And Iquitos and Manaus almost immediately went bankrupt. And with the bust, the epic narratives turned into elegies about nature taking over, these types of monuments of progress, wilderness striking back, and long urban decline from which the cities could not recover. So essentially half a century of pathos. Contrary to both the decline discourse and the previous celebratory tropes, I show that it all actually amounted to a long process of precarious urbanization in both cities. For the urban majorities, the period between the 1880s and the 1960s was characterized by vulnerability and dramatic inequalities. So for one thing, throughout this period, and you can see the numbers there, both cities kept growing regardless of the bust. And as you can see, they're pretty different cities in scale, but within the scale of each country, they're roughly similar. They're between the 10 largest cities of Peru and Brazil. but the paved streets and the opulent buildings were a mirage, deliberately crafted to accommodate the nouveau riche of the rubber era, to reflect their self-image and to attract capital in what were otherwise wretched frontier towns. So most of the cities looked less like this, and this is the famous Avenue Eduardo Ribeiro in Manaus. Just to give you a sense of what I'm saying, this was known as the Avenue, right? So there's a mythology that the cities look like this, but they actually look more like this. And this persistence of precarity made the modernizing impetus of the elites a permanent state of affairs, even in times of crisis. At the core of the project of urban modernization were environmental interventions purposely designed to displace Amazonian nature and the indigenous and riverine peoples whose ways of lives were associated with it. So, as an example, in 1892 was created the first map of Manaus at the height of the rubber era, to include an urban grid, and it actually literally portrayed the parts of the city where the urban majorities lived as empty jungle, right outside of that grid. And there's many of these kinds of maps. So I focus on this precarious growth and displacements. And water, a pervasive force in Amazonia, and of course a crucial resource everywhere, I think provides an ideal lens into this process. I studied in both cities, but I'll give you an example from Iquitos in Peru. So the city had a major problem. Large part of its riverbank cliff tended to collapse into the river when the Amazon hit the bank with increased volume and power, which was especially during the heavy rain season. Heavy rain season is basically year long in the Amazon, but in particular in September to April. This is kind of the wet season where it actually rains a ton. And local authorities constantly wrote desperate telegrams to central authorities asking for help. And I actually had a lot of the telegrams, but I forgot to upload them to the slides here. But they were, there's decade after decade, desperate telegrams saying, city's about to fall, desperate, please help, send money, etc. And this was a scourge with major collapses every decade of the 20th century, reaching a critical point in the 1960s when authorities evacuated entire blocks along the Amazon. The threat included symbolically charged places and strategic infrastructure, so from a major road to a venerable convent, and also the city's famous pier, built by the Liverpool's Booth Company, which was very much a symbol of the modernization of the city in the early 20th century. Doesn't look like much, but at the time, the floating deck was kind of a technological marvel and really crucial to connect the city with the world. And also the prefectura, which would be essentially the highest governmental office in the land, was located there. And as you can see, it's literally in the cliff and often about to fall to the Amazon River. So riverbank protection consumed a large part of the city's resources and became a mantra. And this was all over the press, kind of a permanent existential panic. Stakeholders proposed frankly mad solutions to this problem, including things like diverging the Amazon River, which if you have seen the size of it, is just insane, or completely relocating the city, which at this stage had several 100,000, or at least 100,000 people. Throughout this craze, governmental agencies commissioned a number of studies seeking diagnosis. They received geomorphological, limnological, socioeconomic analysis, aerial photography, bathymetric charts, cadastral maps, etc. Which is really interesting because it shows the city from the air, from below the water, the currents, but also property, the use of land, and the like. So this heterogeneous research corpus reflected the impossibility of separating the city as an ecosystem from the city as a social formation, painting a complex image of the interactions between built environments and their ecological medium. So the interplays between the Amazon River, the phreatic zone and water table, precipitation, and the city's drainage systems and liquid waste infrastructure. Already in the 20th century, at the height of the rubber boom, when city authorities launched a series of public works in Iquitos, sanitary engineers had urged authorities to improve water utilities, not just because of the usual health and sanitary reasons, so tropical diseases and the like, but also because of structural dangers. If effluent was not canalized and disposed into the river, its chemical composition could damage the argillous soil and affect the steadiness of the neighboring riverbanks. Many sanitation works were abandoned in the 1920s when rubber went definitely bust. Because of this, and because the policy towards poor informal neighborhoods implied at best selective provision of basic services, by the 1960s, central riverine neighborhoods still lacked most water utilities. Wastewater circulated uncontrolled, both in plain view and underground. Septic tanks and pipes, where they even existed, tended to overflow. One hydrologist described what he called, I quote, a sewage table, end of the quote, with low acidity, which corroded the city's waterfront. So this means that while the river and rain accelerated the erosion, the collapses were actually largely anthropogenic, caused by the city's historical interaction with the river. So in other words, because of the historical inequalities in urban policy, the urine and excrements of poor people eroded the city's most valuable waterfront real estate. Rather than the modern artifact discrete from quote-unquote nature, Iquitos was part of an ecotechnical system that included human and non-human elements. And yet, authorities remain fixated on their narrative of a city under siege by powerful tropical nature, from which it needed protection. They spent fortunes trying to contain the Amazon River while leaving Iquitos' poorest peoples to their own devices. So this era of urban precariousness ran parallel in Manaus and Iquitos, and it constituted what I call a prehistory of urban informality as generally understood in modern Latin America. Entire urban communities that were constitutive to these urban regimes were displaced and marginalized, but kept organizing themselves, relocating, challenging the idealized urban order. The fulcrum of this precarious urbanization were two large, popular, informal neighborhoods located in the city centers, in floodplains at the junctions of their major rivers and largest streams. And you can see where these neighborhoods were located. As you can see, the maps are quite different, but they're roughly in similar locations, right? Where the big river meets the largest secondary stream. There were the Cidade Flutuante, or floating city, in Manaus, and Belén in Iquitos, especially its lower floodable section called Bajo Belén or Lower Belén. By the mid-20th century, it was these neighborhoods, rather than the wonders of European urban modernity, which became the city's most recognizable spaces. So this, for example, you can see there, is actually a postcard, and a widely circulated one, of the Cidade Flutuante in Manaus. And this is just to give you a sense of what these neighborhoods looked like. This is, again, the Cidade Flutuante from the air. And some more. So amphibious communities in periodically flooded areas in mobile rafts and stilts. They were called water slums, so favelas in Brazil or barriadas in Peru. Both grew around popular markets, encroached upon a key point of contact between the rural and urban economies, exploiting the transitional character of riverine urban Amazonia. They were overcrowded, environmentally fragile, generally very, very poor. But they were also culturally very rich, cosmopolitan, majority indigenous, tight communities with dynamic links to the rest of the cities and to the world. This is a story similar to those of other informal popular neighborhoods in Latin America and beyond, in whose racialized populations and irregular morphology, elites saw invasions of rusticity into the lettered city. But like everywhere, there were also regional specificities. In Amazonia, their seasonality and mobility challenged notions of urban order based on the stability of the built environment. In general, they problematized distinctions between urban and rural, waste and resource, nature and culture, even in ways that were deemed unacceptable. Authorities explicitly associated them with animals, with excrement, because of their lack of services, because they allegedly smelled, because they suffered mosquito-borne diseases, and because of the customs of their people. They compared them to cancer. This is in like official documentation. So this I call environmental marginalization, right? The idea that these places were not marginal, but were marginalized because of their environmental conditions. And both the stigmatized neighborhoods were threatened with imminent eviction. Environmental marginalization was part of a broader tradition of Latin American and national urban politics, including the history of science, but also reflected a distinctive contempt towards native Amazonian peoples and the relationship with nature, and in general, their position within the racial hierarchies of the two post-colonial nations. So bluntly, native Amazonians were not considered suitable for modernity. And arguably that's still very much the case in both nations. Contrast to these very broad trends, specific combinations of national, regional, and local politics and political cultures explain the diverging fates of the neighborhood. The Brazilian military dictatorship of 1964-85 actually destroyed the Cidade Flutuante in 1967, whereas the Peruvian military dictatorship of 1968 to 80 allowed Lower Belén in Iquitos to remain. And you can see what it looks like now in the kind of the high water season. Allowed it to remain, although it is still periodically threatened with eviction. You can see another image of what it looks like. The Latin American Cold War and explosive informal urban growth opened the field for contingency and forced these ambitious military regimes into decisions that would have lasting effects. And this is, I think, the definition of a historical critical juncture. These diverging fortunes mark the beginning of two very different strategies of Amazonian development. So in my book's longest and empirically richest chapters, I study each city under the long military dictatorships based on thinly explored but actually massive local archives from the dictatorship era in both countries. What this revealed is that Peru largely maintained the precarious status quo in Iquitos, which remained an extractive enclave, but since the 1970s oriented towards the extraction of newly discovered oil reserves. Informal urbanization was tolerated and legalized. Manaus, by contrast, was what I call developmental hubris. As part of a policy framed in explicitly colonial terms, the Brazilian generals created a developmental pole through fiscal incentives and direct investments in Manaus through particularly the Manaus Free Trade Zone in 1967, which is a special economic zone, and then the industrial pole of Manaus in 1973. And at one level, they were tremendously successful in their own terms. And you can see some numbers here. The city exploded, one of the fastest growing places during the so-called Brazilian economic miracle. So we're talking tenfold population growth and GDP in the teens, right? So this is truly massive growth, which is exactly what they were looking for. At another level, however, rather than the orderly growth they planned, Manaus mushroomed into dozens of favelas and a process that was often characterized by violent conflict. Manaus, and there's a lot more to say about that, but crucially for us here, Manaus was a catastrophe for the rest of the Amazon. And the final section of my book traces its devastating ecological and social consequences in concentric circles, right? From the pollution of urban ecosystems to hazardous mineral extraction for urban industries. So in the time I have left, I will focus on one aspect of this extended influence. So very close to the confluence between the Amazon River and the Rio Negro, the Black River, in the outskirts of Manaus, and actually one of its main touristic attractions, which you can see there, an abandoned old industrial chimney presides over a vast area. This that you can see there is what remains of the Compañía Siderúrgica da Amazônia Sociedade Anônima, or Siderama, which is an integrated steel mill founded in 1961 and liquidated in 1997. So in fact, it actually both preceded and outlasted the dictatorship. But it was absorbed by the industrial zone, and kind of the Brazilian government invested enormous amounts of money in it. The steel mill was crucial in the plan to transform Amazonian extractivist economy into an industrial one. Ultimately, the free trade zone and the industrial pole became successful through a different kind of industry, so low assembly electronics, kind of a maquila situation, which to this day. But it is impossible to exaggerate how important heavy industry, and especially steel, was in the Brazilian and regional developmentalist imagination of the 20th century. To give you a sense of that, sort of chimneys stacking smoke over Amazonia were often celebrated as emblems of progress. And if you look at this poster from 1970, it literally says the chimneys are the new trees, right? We're referencing the Amazon, and it has images of a factory, which now seems absolutely shocking, but it's truly the hegemonic discourse of the time. In fact, however, in almost 4 decades of existence, the plant never managed to function properly, and it never produced reliable amounts of steel. There are many reasons for that, and we can get into those in the Q&A. But what it did was provide extreme examples of the ecological impact of industrial urbanization in the rainforest. And one aspect, and the one I'll talk about today, is its appetite for energy. Siderama consumed lots of electricity and lobbied to increase and cheapen the city's power grid through the construction of dams, which would also, of course, in turn help it, since dam building demands a lot of steel. As part of the wave of enthusiasm for hydroelectric power, the Brazilian government built the Balbina hydroelectric dam between 1982 and 1988, some 200 kilometers from Manaus in the Uatuma River. Tragically, the history of Balbina intersected with the longer history of the relationship between the Brazilian government and the Waimiri and Atroari peoples of the Amazon. This likely amounted to a genocide. This is a photo of the Balbina Dam in the Uatuma River. This likely amounted to a genocide. The Waimiri Atroari, also known as the Kinja, were close to 6,000 people in 1900. By the end of the 1960s, their population had been halved to 3,000. By the end of the 1980s, their number had been decimated to close to 300. In 1988, again, worth noting, in formerly democratic times, the dam inundated between 2,600 and 4,000 kilometers more than was previously estimated. The resulting shallow lake created a patchy landscape that dried during parts of the year, becoming a breeding ground from disease-carrying mosquitoes, and generally destroyed the territorial integrity of these people. It fragmented the indigenous land and forced up to 1/3 of the remaining Waimiri Atroari population to move. Decisions about the relocation were not coordinated with indigenous elders, but with younger members, likely under coercion and or cooptation, and after years of systematic violence. The Waimiri Atroari did not disappear. The damage inflicted to our community was irreparable, but they do remain politically active. A few years ago, they, for example, accused the Brazilian Army of crimes against humanity. And you can see them, they're a community of Waimiri Atroari people meeting with lawyers in the preparation for this case. This attack against the Waimiri Atroari took place in the name of industrial urbanization. In 1997, after decades of intermittent closures, the Brazilian government finally closed the Siderama plant for good. And what followed was a series of popular invasions during popular invasions during the 2000s. Dozens of families turned the former steel plant into a living space. By the second decade of the 21st century, Siderama's famed city of steel, the paradigmatic built environment, was reclaimed by the rainforest, and from its ruins emerged a favela. And I also, for some reason, cannot find the slide for that. There's a pretty striking image of the steel mill taken over by growth, and a favela emerging from it. Sorry, I somehow missed a couple of slides here. So this trajectory from precarious to planetary urbanization is symptomatic of planetary urbanization during the great acceleration of human impact on the planet during the second half of the 20th century, as cities in the developing world increased by nearly 2 billion people between 1950 and 2000, becoming the majority of the population of the Earth. For the past decade, urban scholars have advocated conceptions of urbanization as extended, spatial transformations in uneven capitalist development, including the commodification of territory, the organization of space around the operational logistics of capitalism, and the irreversible modification of ecosystems. The reach of extended urbanization to Amazonia, one of the world's great frontiers, underscores, I think, this planetary scale. And this has implications for global environmental history and for our understandings of the Anthropocene. Changes in the world's largest tropical rainforest affect global carbon and water cycles. The loss of biodiversity is an incalculable catastrophe, and the destruction of indigenous lives and cultures are simply unforgivable. And that is really the tragedy that underlies the whole process. As archaeologists and paleoanthropologists have been showing for decades, but has got a lot of attention in recent times. You can see, if you remember that kind of recent cover from Science. Amazonia has long been an anthropogenic region, and perhaps it has indeed had cities for centuries. But the imposition of Western-style built environments over civilizations with a unique socio-technical evolution and conception of human-nature relations became an enduring process of displacement and even elimination. So this is then about the co-constitutive relations between social, political, and environmental processes and the scales of these interactions and their impacts. To my mind, these are questions we should ask when we ask about the Anthropocene. And what is the Anthropocene, right? If the task of environmental historians is to provide concrete and materially grounded and situated perspective to these questions, why and how the largest tropical rainforest became urbanized and how it got to look like this, right? This is the Amazon rainforest. And what have been the consequences of these processes? I think that should be part of the answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrián. That was brilliant. And I neglected to mention actually in my introduction when I was introduced to Adrián about an article of Adrián's that I love, which is actually about this steel mill in the Journal of Urban History, and I've just shared it in the chat for everyone to read. So if you are interested in finding out about more about this steel mill that Adrián was talking about, I would really recommend reading that piece. It's a wonderful way, kind of case study of all of these big themes that Adrián's been talking about. So thank you so much for that, Adrián. So let's move over to, and also apologies if I just disappeared there for 2 minutes. My computer like completely died and I had to reset it and come back, but that's the dangers of Zoom, unfortunately. But I'm here now. Pollyanna, we'll move over to you.
Great. Right. Can you see that? Is it working? Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Adrián, for that really brilliant, like insightful talk. Yeah, I learned a lot from it. You can still see my screen, yeah? It's okay. And thank you to Andrew and the other organizers for inviting me. You know, to be honest, I'm not so sure how much the Anthropocene as a concept has figured into my thinking before Andrew got in touch about speaking here, in part because the scale seems a little outsized to what I was working on at the time, which is the book that Andrew very kindly showed, which is a history of American environmentalism based in a very small city in Southern California. I'll talk a little bit more at length about it in a few minutes, but if you've ever been to Santa Barbara, it is very idyllic. It is on a stretch of the California coast that is actually south-facing because it turns into a bight before it straightens back out and to become western-facing, just south of Los Angeles. It's about 100 miles from LA. It is wealthy, but there is a lot of economic stratification. A tiny house will cost you well over $1 million, for example. But it's always been a place that had a certain public image, which is in part what I'll talk about. So, but in thinking about Anthropocene histories, especially of cities, one of the major questions I had is like, what is the distinction, if there's any at all, between this thing called Anthropocene histories and something like just plain old American environmental histories? And how can we think about the Anthropocene as environmental historians, and what are the challenges that come with the concept, especially when it comes to cities? Certainly now we have historians who've never thought about themselves as environmental historians come out fully engaged with questions about the Anthropocene, climate change, history, as well as its political possibilities and even prescriptions. And so I guess the way I want to enter into this question today is like I said, on certain images of place and senses of place that have been constructed and how they can mask a host of social and environmental failings, and how material changes in a landscape and social relations have intertwined over time. You know, urban settlements are one very overt way human beings have transformed the earth, but with ambivalences when it comes to a distinction between what's rural or what's urban, what's nature, and what's culture. And so I'm centered, I think my scholarship to this point has centered on questions of how people have responded or failed to respond to environmental change, and why or what drives a certain type of presentation of place and its political content. And just for my own sort of like just to kind of focus my own thinking about this, regarding the term Anthropocene itself. On one hand, we have this term that encompasses the ideas that human beings' impact on the earth is so profound that we need to designate a new geologic epoch to describe it. Humans have shifted from being a biological agent to a geologic one as well. And our collective activities, from emissions from fossil fuel use, building and construction, which is said to take up almost 40% of our carbon emissions. Industrial agriculture especially dominate these planetary processes, and we fundamentally live in a world shaped by these activities. And yet, on the other hand, we're increasingly deluged with uncontrollable effects of these activities. So there's this distinction between how much we have caused this change and our capacity to respond to them. And we're seeing part of that right now with Hurricane Melissa, at least in the hemisphere I'm in right now, as well as an overt lack of political will to address what's happening. So this cleavage between our activities and our inability to deal with the consequences, at least in a different scale, is one of the questions that I've had in my book. It's a political question for our time, and I think raises questions for those of us who do historical work, whether or not you think of yourself as an environmental historian, as well as some of the assumptions and objectives of the field. And so, like I said earlier, I do think doing history in the Anthropocene is a way of articulating some older ways of doing urban environmental history, particularly in the context I'm most familiar with, which is the environmental history of the United States. This hasn't always been the case. When environmental history was getting started as a subfield in this country, I'm in New York right now, we didn't really have much of a focus on cities. After all, what could be more different than nature and the environment than an urban settlement? But I think in the past 3 decades or so, we've had a real, I think, a real richness on that front. I think it's one of the kind of flourishing subfields within environmental history. Part of this comes from acknowledging that environmental forces are ever present in cities, whether it's through processes of environmental mastery, so-called, to build where one could not before, the insertion of green space, and maybe most pertinent to to a history of cities in the Anthropocene the fact that building construction is a major source of carbon emissions. And so these are some of the ways that I think cities and Anthropocene histories can work with each other to good effect. And I think if you work on the United States, especially in the second half of the 20th century, you especially need to acknowledge the role of the federal government as catalyzing these enormous spatial transformations and reorganizations based on the Federal Highway Act, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the GI Bill, and other pieces of legislation. If some scientists want to date the Anthropocene to about 1950 based on nuclear radioactivity, there's also a rough contemporary in the scale of American post-World War II suburbanization as well, to have this like massive spatial reorganization of an entire country, especially as one as large as the US. And a second question related to this for me and how I think the Anthropocene ultimately makes sense, at least for my work, is how people come together and make sense of their immediate environments in this historical context that's marked by a rise as well in environmental and ecological awareness. And responses to this, if you look at the historical record, aren't always very comfortable. Andrew Hurley, who is the author of a book called Environmental Inequalities on Gary, Indiana, made the observation 30 years ago that the rise of the age of ecology was also the rise of inequality in the United States. A related dynamic that's occupied me a bit recently is this relationship between environmentalism's rise and deindustrialization in the developed world, in the global north, and how one could make a link between these two processes of environmentalism and deindustrialization. We also see the idea of sustainability and designing with nature in urban settings have quite a bit of traction over the past few decades. Certainly in London, you can see evidence of this in new housing projects as well as in the United States. And part of this is as an advertisement for certain lifestyles, a certain urban sustainable lifestyle. There's a desire being conveyed in living in a place that seems to be in harmony with its natural setting. And so how that image is constructed and disseminated is one of the focal points of my work to this point. Yep. And so this is one of the goals of my book was actually to provide an account of an environmentalism that I believed was quite common in the US, but maybe underarticulated or theorized. But when you try to write a book about environmentalism, about the history of environmentalism, you run into the issue of how to define it. Because I was focused on a quite affluent city on the Southern California coast, I wanted to make sense of the development of this environmental sensibility that both treasured the natural beauty of a place, but also used that beauty as a weapon against proposals that might have ameliorated some social issues, particularly involving housing and race. And one of the first issues I ran into, and the one that I definitely dealt with last, was how to actually define environmentalism as a movement. And that took quite a bit of time. And actually, I had several people who read the manuscript mention that I never did, and that I would need to do so. So the definition I came, at least to, in its basic terms, is that this is a movement and an outlook that demands that humans place priority on the quality of the non-human world, including landscapes of all types, urban settings, wildlife, other species, bodies of water, and so forth, in weighing their activities. And then out of this general definition, we have myriad qualifications, critiques, and competing interpretations. There are legal and regulatory ones, understandings based in social movements, such as environmental justice, biodiversity and wilderness, and kind of quotidian pledges to that involve individual efforts to recycle, reduce waste, and use greener products. This runs into a conundrum where environmentalism really can be what Keith Woodhouse, who wrote a really brilliant history of radical environmentalism, calls a movement that lacks a central idea. So I think this broad understanding, this overly broad understanding of environmentalism really risks diffusing the movement as a catch-all from everything from protecting natural space to buying sustainable products to reining in the kind of excesses of economic growth might actually lose significance. But there is, I think, a more radical way of looking at environmentalism. It's to say that the movement's ambitions aren't just a scattered set of interests regarding environmental quality, or a movement that's a little bit misguided in placing priority of wilderness, of endangered species over human beings, but really an imperative for the transformation of the world. So there's a refusal, ultimately, I think, to define human relationships with nature and other species through utility, domination, consumption, and it really takes seriously not just the survival of every living thing on the planet, but its flourishing. So the environmentalism I focus on is really in contrast to that. And it's quite a bit more politically ambivalent and maybe more widespread and maybe less combative, and it's one oriented to different objectives. And I called this in the book ownership environmentalism, which it really focused on the interests of homeowners, especially, but property owners in general, and the way that they use the environment to their own kind of political ends and priorities. So it's really a means to fulfill social goals and claim authority. Nature might have independent value or seem pre-political, but it's really weaponized to abet social exclusions and enforce community norms. And so I think it's in a way you have to show how looking at the historical emergence of this movement requires looking at human priorities, politics, and actions. I think this term, which I kind of came to maybe not so willingly, but someone told me to try and find a catch-all term for what I was trying to describe, really helped maintain and regulate social stratification. So instead of being a challenge to property owners in Santa Barbara, as well as other affluent cities throughout the United States, it really helped provide a bulwark against the encroachment of forces that would seemingly ruin one's immediate surroundings. And so homeowners, I think, become, at least in the United States, one of environmentalism's major constituencies, and maintaining the economic value of a single family home found a useful accomplice in appeals to environmental quality. And so I had some good reasons to focus on Santa Barbara, even though it seems like a fairly medium-sized coastal city in the United States would not seem the most auspicious place to center a book on. Santa Barbara has a population of about 100,000 people, like a lot of cities in the US, like the one I live in. But here in this slide, you have on the right, a cover of the Sierra Club Bulletin, this environmental advocacy organization in the US. It's March 1969 issue, so you have these two black and white photographs, one arranged above the other. So you have the one with the shape of the bird, and then you have the offshore oil platform. So there's no text on the cover that identifies it, but any Sierra Club member or reader of this issue would have no trouble identifying the place in an event. It references an oil spill that began on January 29th, 1969, 3 miles offshore from Santa Barbara. Residents of the city experienced this spill. So after a few days, after this blowout, the oil hits the beaches and pollutes a very wide swath of beach, killing wildlife, and becomes kind of a national symbol of kind of environmental degradation in the US. So residents experienced the spill as an assault and a betrayal of life they made in this place, famed for its natural beauty. These images spread really far afield and really gave instant international attention to the region, and also catalyzed federal and local environmental action. This oil spill is often referenced as a central catalyst in the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency, which began on January 1st, 1970, when Richard Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as a catalyst for the first Earth Day in April 1970. Widely circulated photographs of the beaches and wildlife drenched in oil really contrasted sharply with the qualities and comforts that local citizens assumed as one of the major benefits of living in the area. And this newsworthiness of the oil spill made it seem quite exceptional, even though oil spills are actually a quite regular occurrence throughout the world. But in a certain light, this oil spill was, until the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska in 1989. This blowout in the Santa Barbara Channel was the largest oil spill in US history. So you run into the question about how this city came to attract enough horrified sympathy to usher in a national and international environmental reckoning. And so in part, this is a story of a heralded location and its inhabitants' efforts at environmental quality. That's kind of the like heartwarming version of the story. But instead of looking forward from the oil spill, I look back and ask how, over the course of the earlier decades in the 20th century, cities' residents constructed a version of paradise that was motored by an aspiration to create an urban environment that seemed to align seamlessly with its remarkable natural surroundings, to the extent that this oil spill seemed to be a mass violation of what they had constructed. And so I argue that Santa Barbara's interventions in the local landscape became a type of national template for an environmentalism centered on the needs and desires of the properties. And this took, and sheltering these conditions took on considerable significance over time. And in part, ownership, like legal and perceived belonging and possession of land in and around Santa Barbara, shaped expectations of a type of life that the oil spill violated. Ownership through home ownership, or just through owning land, really connotes improvement, investment, and worth. And so the property really believe that they deserve a special protection. So ultimately, I make this argument that modern American environmentalism grew out of the political and social concerns of affluent citizens to make it really resonant and durable. In Santa Barbara, the region's natural surroundings provided a convenient and powerful justification for their activities. And this is understandable in a certain extent, because who could really lodge a serious complaint about placing the environment at the center of an urban design vision? This work of transforming an exceptional natural place into a comfortable place of residence was meant to confer certain types of privileges, not just to possess land, but also socially. I think it demarcated the boundaries of environmental concern to those who had an acknowledged hand in contributing to its improvement. So features that register as typical to modern environmentalism today, such as quality of life issues around access to open space and kind of preventing suburban sprawl, kind of hold here. And so after the work involved in creating ideal domestic conditions, appeals to environmental considerations really served as a crucial rhetorical weapon for homeowners to protect their investment. So finally, I think the focus on social relations I use in my book, I hope is one way to engage with some issues that the Anthropocene raises, especially regarding the uneven effects and consequences of climate change. And maybe we can help transcend them. Certainly, Santa Barbara itself is still not immune to these effects. The first slide I showed was the Thomas Fire in 2017, which at the time was the largest wildfire in California history. I think it's now down to maybe like 8th or 9th, which just shows the kind of speed and scale of change that's occurred in less than a decade. But I didn't necessarily come to write this book in order to primarily do environmental advocacy, but at the same time, I think one of the major reasons cities are really vital for thinking through the Anthropocene or environment or whatever we might call it is really, it provides ways of engaging with various threads, historical threads, whether they're social, economic, environmental, cultural, and a lot of times while writing this book, I wondered if I really was an environmental historian because I was writing about a social movement that dealt with a lot of other things besides the environment that would make it seem like it wasn't necessarily environmental. But I think there is an urgency in writing these histories, writing these environmental histories that pull together economic threads, cultural and social threads, and look seriously at the ways that people live, where they live, and how they engage with the world, and how it animates their politics and social commitments. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Pollyanna. That was fantastic. Really great. And a nice compliment to the other paper as well. So we're going to move into Q&A now. So if whoever's in charge of recording could stop recording, that would be appreciated. So I'll kick us off with a question, and while I'm